In the past, our lecture series usually focused on a certain region of the world or a certain policy issue. Well, we're going big and we're going downright intergalactic tonight. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Craig Benjamin. I asked him when I met him tonight how he got to be a historian after having been a jazz musician. And I heard somebody else in the audience ask him that, but he wants to tell us that story himself. So, Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you, Annette.
Welcome.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for turning out on such an evening blighted with severe weather, or at least that's what the message you get if you've been watching Wood TV weather this evening. I'm just so impressed with your courage coming out under such severe conditions as this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. Dixie invited me to present at the World Affairs Council, I think only a year or so after I arrived. This is my first, 2005, Dixie, thank you. And I think as an immigrant to the country, Dixie rightly chose the topic of having me speak about immigration. So I put together a four-part series on immigration, which I thought went very well, and I learned a lot myself researching that, Dixie, I've got to say. That may have paid off because next Tuesday, a week today, my wife and I will be in Detroit having our final interviews for US citizenship. So if all goes well next Tuesday, then thank you. Thank you. So that's a pretty big deal for us, and I think it was all that training and that research, Dixie, that has got me this far. So thank you. I'm just a slightly hoarse. I've been comparing this morning a wonderful TEDx presentation that was at Grand Valley State University this morning. Very exciting to see Grand Valley join the rank of these wonderful, hard-hitting presentations today focused on sustainability. I had the pleasure of introducing a dozen or so outstanding speakers who are all focused on sustainability in various issues. But tonight, a very, very different topic, and I'd like to welcome you all to the idea and the concepts behind, and I think the value behind, big history, which is a rather revolutionary new approach to combining history and sciences into a interdisciplinary narrative. This is the first of a four-part series of lectures. Big history, before I introduce what it is and tell you something about its value to students and I think to all of us, I just want to give you some sense of the incredible growth that big history is going through right at this very moment. A textbook, firstly, with two colleagues, Cynthia Brown and David Christian and myself, has been written and will be published next year. McGraw-Hill, who are one of the leading educational publishers, have decided that the market is ready for a big history textbook, pitched at the college undergraduate market, and we had the pleasure of writing that text. That will be available next year. The History Channel somewhat independently discovered big history. One of the directors there had done a series on the universe. Some of you may have seen this for the History Channel, a four-part series on the universe. And then with a bit of research, he came up with the idea of doing a one-episode, 2-hour history of the Earth. And as he started to research, he realized there was this whole group out there of big historians and approached some of us to come over to Los Angeles to record some interviews for this episode. At the same time, I'll come back to this, at the same time, no less than Bill Gates had discovered big history through buying a series of DVDs issued by the Teaching Company. Some of you may be aware of this company in Virginia that puts out lecture series by outstanding professors. My colleague David Christian, one of my co-authors on the textbook, had done a series on big history, and Bill Gates likes to run on his running machine every morning looking at a 30-minute DVD lecture while he runs. And he accidentally, serendipitously got hold of this series and decided that he just fell in love with big history. When he heard that the History Channel was interested, he immediately signed a partnership deal with the History Channel to have them now produce not one but 10 documentaries over the next year or so. So you can look for a veritable flood of big history documentaries over the next year or two. This has inadvertently had an impact on our plans here for a presentation of an excerpt from the episode that I filmed. Once Bill Gates signed this deal with the History Channel were told not to allow any excerpts to be shown until the entire package was put together. So even though our brochure suggests that during the fourth presentation in this series, we'll be seeing an excerpt, unfortunately, for copyright reasons, that is now not possible. Instead, as I'll tell you in a moment, I'll be giving a final presentation on the big history of the future. So Bill Gates decided that what needs to happen with big history is that it needs to be taught not just at the college undergraduate level, but at the high school level. And he has put together a dynamic team of technology people, historians, some of us are working as advisors on this, to create a free online course in big history to be shown to 9th and 10th grade students. There's an initial trial next school year, of only 6 schools around the world. Because of my location here, East Grand Rapids High School will be one of those 6 trial schools, so EGR should be very proud of that. The following year, 50 or 60 schools. The year after that, it's going to go out internationally and be made freely available for schools all around the world. So that's happening right now as well. And then at a meeting in Italy this summer, a group of us big historians made the decision to found the International Big History Association. At this stage, all of us are members of our own professional associations. So I'm very active in the World History Association, for example. Colleagues who teach big history from a geology perspective or an astrophysics perspective are active in their professional organisations. We decided it was time to create an International Big History Association in its own right. And after much discussion, it was decided that Grand Valley State University was the ideal location to become the new global base for big history. So at Grand Valley, the Global Institute for Big History will be established early next year. You can see that down the very bottom there that Microsoft are very keen on this. Independent of the Gates project, Microsoft can see a lot of potential here for teaching technology to work with the Gates project, to work at the university level as well. So we received a substantial grant from Microsoft just a couple of days ago to help fund the initial startup of the Global Institute for Big History right here in West Michigan. So there is an awful lot going on with big history at the moment. I just wanted to give you some sense of the sort of buzz in the genre. A little bit about me, apart from the fact that I love mountains. I came here from Australia 7.5 years ago. I discovered Grand Valley through the website, the Chronicle of Higher Education, as so many of my colleagues have done, and was so impressed when I came over here, even in the middle of perhaps the first blizzard I'd ever experienced in my life. My one day on campus was January 2003. It was a very bleak day here, I can tell you. And we even got somewhat lost being taken from Mackinac to the Kirchhoff Centre, and the professor who was leading us took us into the woods accidentally in a whiteout. And my wife and I wondered whether we would actually survive this one day on campus. At a critical moment, the bell tower started ringing, and the guy said, "Oh, we should be going that way." And we headed, and I've never been so glad since to sort of drag myself up the steps of the Kirchhoff Centre, I tell you. Despite that near-death experience, we were so impressed by what we saw at Grand Valley that I immediately took the offer of a position there, and my wife and I moved here from Sydney, Australia. And we are very happily living in Easttown, just 5 minutes down the road from here. I'm an associate professor now in the history department, and I also am a faculty in residence in the beautiful Myer Honours College at Grand Valley. So very, very happy there. My specialised field, along with big history, is ancient Central Asia, of all things. And most of my research is on nomadic groups, nomadic confederations, their migrations through Central Asia, their role in connecting the great civilizations, for example, of Han China and the Romans via the Silk Roads and other exchange networks. So I've written a number of books on Silk Roads studies, nomadic history, many book chapters and so on. But I've also been passionate about big history for about 16 years and have written quite a bit on that as well. At Grand Valley, I do teach ancient Eurasian history. I teach Introduction to Liberal Education. I teach historiography as a capstone course. I teach Michigan teachers as part of a graduate program, part of their Masters of Education. And I teach a lot of big history as well. Big history is perhaps the most recent way that historians are trying to conceptualize, understand, and communicate the global past. Actually, more than the global past. It's a natural extension of a trend that we've seen over the last 25 to 30 years of trying to understand human history on larger and larger scales. I'm sure you're aware that national history has been the dominant genre since the emergence of nationalism within the discipline in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, the most respected history of all was actually being written on a very large scale. I'm thinking right back in ancient times, some of the Greco-Roman historians, I mean, Herodotus, the father of Western history himself, was conceiving of history on a macro scale, trying to bring in all the peoples, all the cultures, all the ideas, religions, and so on of the world as he knew it. The same thing was happening in China with Sima Qian. With the collapse of those great civilizations, we saw religion trying to understand human history on a similarly macro scale. Through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the most respected historians have tried to understand history on a very large scale, looking for philosophical ideas, themes, trends, and patterns that you can only observe on this large scale. As I say, only in the 19th century did smaller scale national history eclipse the larger scale. But from the 1970s on, the world history movement emerged, particularly here in the United States, led by people like William McNeill, Philip Curtin, Marshall Hodgson. And before the decade was out, more and more universities had decided to keep the Western civilization approach going. That is, and many of you may have taken Western Civs courses when you were at university, but to add to this the history of other regions of the planet as well, to bring in China, to bring in Africa, not just Africa after Europeans turn up, but what was happening in Africa long before Europeans arrived, to talk about South America, the Australasia, the Pacific World Zone, and so on. World history grew, became increasingly popular. The College Board decided to add an AP course, Advanced Placement course in World History, which is now the fastest growing of all the AP courses. And the United States now is the absolute global centre of the world history movement. I have the pleasure of being on the Executive Council of the World History Association and am absolutely dedicated to that. But the same argument that world historians made, and that is that national history only makes sense if you look at it, if you see it as being embedded in a much larger context again, that same argument holds just as true for the big historian who said, frankly, even human history as a whole only makes sense if you see it in another larger context, if you step back another frame or two, if you see human history in the biological context of the planet or the geological context of the planet. Even beyond that, our planet exists, of course, in a particular part of the universe. What do we know about our particular area of the universe? What do we know about the origins of the universe itself? And how does human history fit into these larger and larger frames? So as bizarre as it might sound to you, big history actually begins with the origins of the universe. But this is a course primarily about humans, human history on a large scale, as I want to show you tonight. It was devised by my colleague David Christian at Macquarie University back in 1989, so it's pretty recent. Now, David was given the job by his department, the Modern History Department at Macquarie, which is, by the way, where I met David and where I got my PhD, of coming up with a single semester introductory history course for incoming first-year students at Macquarie. And David was pondering this, thinking, well, where should I start such a course? As he looked at all the textbooks that were available, most of them were beginning with the origins of civilization and writing roughly 5,000 years ago. This didn't make any sense to David. He said, firstly, we're leaving out about 95% of human history if we only start with cities and states. What was going on long before that? I've got to at least begin with the origins of human history. And then he said, but the appearance of Homo sapiens as this extraordinary, unique species only makes sense if we see it as part of the great evolutionary radiation of the hominids, which grew out of primate evolution, which grew out of mammalian evolution before that. And so he kept pushing himself back and back, saying, where can I start this course? And after a series of heated discussions with his colleagues who thought he was crazy, said the only place I can logically begin this course is at that point before which we can say nothing. And that is the point 13.7 billion years ago when a singularity appeared in some unknown void and eventually began to inflate and created everything that exists in the universe today. Another bizarre part of the story that I'll discuss with you in more details next time we meet. I became David's teaching assistant. David is also a specialist in ancient Central Asia, author of many books. He was my PhD dissertation supervisor. He said, Craig, you look like a sensible chap. I want you to come along and help me teach big history. I knew nothing about big history. I fell in love with it the minute I was exposed to it and have been teaching it very happily ever since. 8 years in Australia, 7.5 years here. There are now dozens of big history courses taught around the world. Australia extensively, all across the United States, in the Netherlands, in Russia, in Colombia, in Fiji, in Hawaii. Big history is proliferating as an undergraduate, introductory, particularly first-year general education course, which is where it's superbly located, I think, within the academy. And as I just mentioned, Grand Valley and indeed all of West Michigan now finds itself at the center of this. We met here in summer. This is just a group of big historians. David Christian is here in the black shirt. You see myself somewhat unsteadily here on a rocky shelf. This is a quarry. It doesn't look much, but it's actually a very important quarry in geology history. This is the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, where this geologist, Walter Alvarez, first began to discover evidence of an extensive iridium infiltration in this layer. And as he began to investigate this around the world, eventually he realized that wherever he looked at this barrier between the Cretaceous and Tertiary, he was finding high levels of iridium. He started to piece this together with other pieces of evidence from the Americas, and in the end came up with the extraordinary theory, which is now really a paradigm of modern science, that what put paid to the dinosaurs 65 million years ago was a massive asteroid impact in the Yucatan Peninsula. But the evidence for it was first found right here in this quarry in the Gola de Botelli in the Marche region of eastern Italy. And when we were thinking about a place to have a big history gathering, we thought we couldn't do any better than here. So we all went off to Italy and spent a couple of weeks there in August. So Walter Alvarez, Barry Rodriguez teaches this in Maine, Fred Spear, senior professor at the University of Amsterdam, and Lowell, who's teaching this at Villanova University. Just a few of my colleagues. The program for the series then, tonight, what is big history, why does it matter? I hope to make that case to you. Next week, in a single hour, I hope this doesn't offend our science colleagues here, I hope to cover all the major paradigms of science. What do we know about the origins of the universe, of stars? Why do stars matter? How is our planet formed? What do we know about plate tectonics? How did our planet acquire an atmosphere, and so on? How does life appear on a lifeless rock? Can we believe the chemical evolutionary theory that organic chemicals are able to evolve to eventually create life, as I want to show you next week briefly. And I'll leave you next week with a 1-minute history of life on Earth. So an action-packed hour next week, I can assure you. After that, after 13.7 billion years of history, week 3 will be a piece of cake. 200,000 years of human history in an hour, that's nothing. We'll do that very easily. Of course, we'll be looking at human history on the macro scale. We'll be imagining that we're on the moon looking down on the way human history has unfolded over the last 200,000 years. We'll look at the first lifeways of the hunter-gatherers. We'll look at the extraordinary, the most important revolution in human history, the transition from nomadic hunter-gathering to sedentary agriculture, and how everything else that's followed in history has been built upon that one transition. And then again, we'll look at the key eras and the key revolutions of human history. There haven't been many when you're looking down from the moon. A handful, maybe 4 or 5 major revolutions in human history. And I want to conclude this series by looking at the future on the scale of 100 years from now, right? The scale in which my students in Grand Valley play a significant role, the scale that they can impact by their behaviours today. And then the scale of 1,000 years from now, which is really just a bit of speculative scientific fun because we really don't know. And then finally, on the scale of hundreds of billions of years into the future, when we have a very clear idea about the fate of our planet, our solar system, about the imminent collision of our galaxy with Andromeda, and about the ultimate, or so it looks at the moment, the ultimate heat death of the universe. No big crunch, no big bounce, or so the Hubble Space Telescope is telling us. So the history of the ancient past, the recent past, and the future. Tonight's lecture then, 4 parts. What is big history? And I'll move quickly. I know we only have an hour, and then we'll look forward to your questions. Some of the objections that might already be percolating out there in your minds. But this is just bizarre, Craig. How can this work? So let's address some of these objections up front. The idea that big history is like a map. It gives us a sense of orientation. It gives us a sense of our place in this unfolding cosmic story. And finally, when you look at history on this macro scale, surely we seem utterly insignificant, right, in our short-lived existence. But I think big history, in much the same way that most other creation stories do, can actually say something about human significance, even on this macro scale. So big history. A brief comparison firstly with traditional history. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of history buffs here, probably plenty of History Channel fans. Traditional history generally is the study of individuals or the study of change, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, Industrial Revolution. Different periods, we've divided it up nicely between ancient, sort of medieval, modern history. Different regions, of course. You might be a specialist in Eurasia. Ancient Eurasia was one of my fields. Or nations, of course. History of Italy, of France, of Australia. Right? The result of this, for most students, and indeed for many historians, is a somewhat fragmented, and I could say, I think, meaningless view of the past. We've got a lot of information about different things, different processes, different people. It doesn't seem to add up to anything coherent. There's no unifying paradigm or model that all of this information seems to fit into, unlike the sort of paradigms that our colleagues in the sciences have. Right? A couple of analogies here. It's like shining a flashlight around in your attic. Wherever that beam falls, we've got a very clear glimpse of that corner. Or there's a spider up there, or the rat scar, whatever. Right? But everything else is in darkness. Or like looking at fireflies in the garden, which were just beautiful in my garden here right through the summer in East Town. And again, these little glimpses of light, these parcels of illumination and knowledge, but everything else was still very, very dark around them. So the argument that firstly world historians would make, and now big historians, a true illumination, a true understanding of the past requires somehow broadening, right, the scope of our inquiry, but also deepening it somehow. Looking at connections, looking at relationships. Here's the giant jigsaw puzzle of human history. We've got this bit very clear, and this bit and this bit, but what's happening here? And what can we draw connections? Are there relationships between these different elements that we can pull out over very large spatial and chronological scales? Right? That's just a sense, an initial sense of where the difference might lie. So big history is trying to offer this very unified view of the past, literally looking at all of history on the largest possible timescale that we're aware of. And nobody I've read at the moment, no physicist seems to have any idea of what there was before the Big Bang. So we begin at that point, continue right through to this moment, and then see how far we can take this story into the future. Some of my colleagues who are teaching traditional world history boast that they are covering 5,000 years of history in a single semester. And I say, well, in a big history class, we're covering about 200 billion years of history in 14 years, in 14 weeks. So don't come to me with your complaints and problems. What you see on this scale is a real unity to the way this story has unfolded, a real sense of meaning and coherence. I don't mean meaning in any spiritual sense, religious sense, just somehow as all these pieces come together into a single sort of flowing narrative, you get some sense of how this has led to that, how this is connected to that, the role humans have played in this story, and where this river, if you like, might be flowing, might be taking us. It's not just about the past. So much of history is about the past and condemned by a lot of students for that reason. I often see students sort of dragging their feet somewhat coming into the first day of a compulsory general education history class at Grand Valley, right? You have to take a history class, historical perspectives. Oh, okay, I really didn't like history at school. It's about boring dead people in the past and it's of no relevance to me. What big history shows, and indeed what any well-taught history shows, is that we only understand our time right now with a clear sense of how we've gotten to this moment, to this time. And this time is part of one of those handfuls of revolutions I mentioned a moment ago. The modern revolution, for want of a better name. It's so recent we haven't got a better term yet. We're living right through it. But this is clearly the revolution ushered into human history initially by the Industrial Revolution only 200 years ago, is the most profound cultural change in all of human history. And our poor students, your children, have inherited this moment. What's their place in it? What's their role in it? How will it unfold during their lifetimes and the lifetimes of their children and grandchildren? In traditional history, again, I think, I've got a cinema photographer down here, because it's almost as though the lens that historians use to examine the past has got stuck at one magnification. That somehow we argue it's only individuals who make history. It's the George Washingtons, it's the Julius Caesars, the Adolf Hitlers, the George Bushes, Barack Obamas that make history. We're stuck on that, right? Individuals make history. We've forgotten we've got this whole bag of lenses available to us as historians. And big history opens up this huge array of lenses. Of course you'll zoom into something very significant, very small when necessary. But let's not forget the macro wide angle. Let's not forget everything in between as we outline the big story and then use our other lenses to zoom in to find examples to illustrate this big story. Now, if you've been to and looked at the Nazca lines, then this is what you see on the ground. This is, I think, is what most historians see, right? Your face is so close to what you're looking at, sometimes you can't see the spider for the lines on the land. Big history is suggesting, let's climb into our helicopters. Let's use other lenses that are available to us. Let's try and see patterns that are not discernible if we just spend all of our time at the close-up level. So it's interdisciplinary, it offers a range of perspectives, and it attempts in its own modest way to contribute to consilience, which is a word that I think was coined by Edward Wilson in a superb book called Consilience, in which he argued that it's just silly treating all these parcels of knowledge as somehow being different. That scientific knowledge, social science knowledge, calculus, history, philosophy is all part of the great knowledge stream that humans have created. And that somehow we've lost sight of these connections through our descent into the extremely specialised world. Which is not to say, and I would never say, that the work of the specialist is not critically important to our story, but our job is to take these pieces, pull back, and try and see what might be revealed through looking at the larger scale. At the end of a course, and in fact at the end of the 4 weeks that we'll be together, there will be a quiz at the end. I'll expect you to be able to offer coherent answers to all these questions, right? In one sentence or less. How and when was the universe created? That's pretty easy. I'm sure you all know the Big Bang Theory and probably the evidence for it. If not, we'll cover that in about 2 minutes next week. It's straight ahead. At the other end, what do we know about the ultimate fate of the universe? Actually, quite a lot, I think, at the moment. Quite a lot, because of recent Hubble telescope observations and other data. How and when was our sun and solar system created? How do you make a solar system out of a cloud of gas? What is a sun anyway? What is a star? Our own planet, how was that created? How does it happen to be in just the right place, just the right position from the sun? One of my colleagues, Fred Speer from Amsterdam, calls that the Goldilocks principle. This one's too far away, this one's too close, this one is just right. And he applies that to all these elements of scientific and human history. What forces created and shaped the Earth's land? Can we really believe that these continents are drifting, moving across the planet? That all the continents were once joined together into a single super Pangaea continent? What's driving this extraordinary movement of these crustal plates? How did we acquire an atmosphere? Was there always oxygen here? Or was oxygen created by early photosynthesizing organisms? So how and when does life first appear? How does it assume the variety of forms we see today? Unapologetically here we teach evolution by natural selection and the overwhelming evidence that supports it. And how and when do humans appear out of this evolutionary mix? So that's for lectures 2 and 4. And these are sort of more human history type questions. How did we live then for the first 95% of our history? What was hunter-gatherer life like? What were our beliefs? How did we survive? What did having to be on the move all the time mean about populations? How did we keep populations small and manageable? And so many other questions about the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. This general question, philosophical question, when do you think human history begins? If you had to answer that question, when does human history begin and why do you choose that moment, that point? There's no right or wrong answer. I've just read 44 essays on this very question from my History 101 class, 44. I can't tell you the range of suggestions that I've just read. Everything from the Big Bang to just a couple of minutes ago. And all sorts of reasonable arguments anywhere along that continuum. Again, this major transition to agriculture. How do we find ourselves living in huge cities and states? What's the advantage? How does power emerge in the middle of this? Coercive power. How do these huge agrarian civilizations, Roman, Persian, Han, Aztec, Inca, how do they appear? How do they maintain themselves? How do they evolve over 4,000 years of history? And then we move quite quickly to the modern revolution. Right? Why can we argue that 200 years ago, another profound revolutionary change began in human history? What are some of the criteria that would support that argument? To say that humans today are living in profoundly different times to humans a mere 200 years ago. And why does this modern revolution take a European form? Why are we using European languages, wearing European clothing? Why wasn't it driven by the Islamic world, as it nearly was in the 13th century perhaps? Why wasn't it driven by Song China, as it nearly was in the 12th century? Why eventually is it Europe that drives this modern revolution and creates the modern industrial society that we all inhabit? And the 20th century, is it really that different? Can we make a case that 20th century was one of the most unique moments in all of human history, and why? And finally, again, we come back to the future. Does a study of history on this scale really help us predict the future? Is this the job of historians to be thinking about the future? Normally you'd say, no, you guys are specialists in the past. On this scale, maybe. Of course, a lot of my students, and perhaps many of you folk, already feel they have the answers to these questions. They really don't need to address them. They say, Professor, I know that God created humans, and I know when it happened 6,000 years ago, and I don't know why scientists are just trying to mess with our minds like that. You know? I actually had an essay that said some very uncomplimentary things about scientists and Charles Darwin, and that Darwin's theory was deliberately designed to upset religious people. And, I'll have to have a chat to that young lady tomorrow. But these students are absolutely committed to their faith. They feel they already know the answers to these questions, right? My job is to say that, like all of the creation myths that have ever existed, we need to use the most up-to-date knowledge we have, right, to try and explain our own origins, to try and answer all these questions. And then we talk about this. You can imagine a class like this demands a lot of discussion. So I'll lecture a couple of times a week. The third class, the Friday class, is always a class discussion on a range of difficult questions that each week of the course throws up. And we try and work out ways of accommodating multiple versions of reality, multiple creation stories, right? And we try and find a way of suggesting these are not mutually exclusive belief systems, that many scientists are profoundly religious, and that many religious people work out ways of seeing evolution or Big Bang as the mechanism that their God put in place to allow species to adapt to changing environments, for example. So we do work very hard to bridge the cultural divide, which particularly right at this moment, the last few weeks, is clearly blighting the country. Not in the classroom, though. We try and make sure that we don't have a cultural divide in the classroom. There is a way of reaching across here, right? These are not mutually exclusive belief systems. Too much science. Some kids come in and say, well, I thought this was a history class, Professor. What are those stars and things doing up there? In fact, several times I've had some student who missed the first introductory lecture, like this, turned up a little late for the second lecture, walked in and saw Big Bang, stars, exploding galaxies, and said, damn, I'm in the wrong room, and left again. And sent me an email later that, Professor, I must have gone to the wrong room. And, no, man, that was the right room. Come back. So the course is pitched at the scientific beginner. What really shocked me when I came to Grand Valley is how many students had never had the Big Bang theory explained to them clearly, had no idea of the overwhelming evidence for the Big Bang theory. And of course, when we move on to plate tectonics, a shadowy view. When we move on to evolution, the number of students that have never ever had this theory explained clearly to them staggered me. Right? Even at Grand Valley, a university dedicated to liberal education. The reaction of many of these students when they hear these theories explained clearly and in a non-threatening way, and then when they see the overwhelming evidence that supports them, and when they realize that 99.9% of all the scientists on this planet, whatever faith or cultural tradition they come from, accept these as the best explanations we have at the moment, students, they can be hostile, they can be very angry that this has been kept from them, and then they go through a real few weeks of torment as they try and work out how to accommodate this overwhelming evidence that the rational part of their mind is accepting with a lot of what they've been taught so far. We deal with the biggest questions that science has to answer. This is exciting science. Objections. Let me have a quick drink of water so I can answer my own objections. Now, the first objection surely is a pretty obvious one. Benjamin, you are covering 200 billion years of history in 14 weeks. I mean, that must be so thin. That must be so lacking in detail, right, as to be almost totally meaningless. And you might be thinking, how can this man insult me by saying next week in an hour he'll give me a decent overview of the three major paradigms of science, right? The truth is, some details do disappear, right? There are certain, what George Washington had for breakfast, or, we don't talk about Hitler and Eva Braun getting married, and there's a lot of details that disappear, right? I'm not saying they're not important, they're not exciting. For a lot of historians, they're very, very exciting. But I'm saying as we pull back, as we pan back, other details come into view that are lost entirely on the small-scale historian, right? That they never have to deal with. I'll give you just one quick example. The importance of population. Normally the realm of demographers. In big history, population is just a critical theme that runs right through the course. And I'm not going to give you the whole course right now. Let's just think about the 20th century, right? The 20th century. We know that human populations in 1900 were 1.6 billion. That's the best estimate that demographers can give us based on censuses and other data, right? 100 years later, they had quadrupled to 6 billion people. That's 1 century. So humans have been around for 200,000 years. It took 200,000 years to reach the first billion people, essentially, and then 1 century, right, to add another 5 billion people. That fact alone is staggering, right? It creates all sorts of alarm bells in my mind. Can we imagine this planet coping with another 4-fold increase in population during the 21st century? Can you imagine a population of 24, 25 billion people and having to deal with that? I mean, so that's another separate issue that we need to consider for the future. But how do we explain that? How do we explain a graph that looks like that in which human population, this is only on the scale of 10,000 years. Imagine this stretched out the window there to the scale of 200,000 years. And how do we explain this almost terrifying spike in the last 100 years? Historians in the future will probably look back on the 20th century and say, this is the most important feature of the 20th century. Never mind 2 world wars, never mind a Great Depression, never mind the emancipation of women, increasing literacy, whatever. This clearly is the most staggering fact of the 20th century. Now, you just don't hear this in a regular history course, right? When you couple this with the other really phenomenal process of the 20th century, which is the extraordinary increase in the rate of technological innovation, right? And clearly there's got to be some connection here. We could get into a whole chicken and egg argument, and I want to save this for lecture 3, but did human populations explode for some reason, necessitating rapid technological innovation just to feed, clothe, and house that many people, right? Or did technological innovation explode for some reason, creating an environment, creating conditions that allowed for this many people to be alive? If we weren't feeding, clothing, housing this many people, there wouldn't be this many people. So there's clearly a link here between these two, as I say, staggering features of the 20th century. What is it? We'll talk about that in lecture 3. A second objection, we have to go beyond the boundaries of our discipline, which is very, very true. And one of the most daunting aspects of teaching big history for historians is I'm not a trained scientist. I never studied biology at grad school or molecular biology or geology or physics. How can I stand up in a classroom full of often science majors and talk to them about their discipline, if you like? And we do enter, I mean, we could have a list of probably 50 or more disciplines that we enter at various stages. Now, the truth is that you can acquire sufficient knowledge of the scientific aspects of the course to teach it coherently, to teach it well. I mean, it means doing a lot of reading, obviously. It means being a bit of a science junkie, like most big historians are, and really embracing constant revisions to the theory, new ideas, and so on. But you also argue that really to understand your own country, you've got to leave it. To understand human history, we've got to get out of human history. We have to look at human history from the perspective of a biologist or a geologist, even a cosmologist. And we have to embrace their different perspectives on this. It's an enriching experience for students, for professors, indeed for the entire historical discipline. So again, we unashamedly embrace this interdisciplinarity. Third objection, this is somewhat of a theoretical objection. I've studied a lot of postmodernist theory, and postmodernism really argues, when it addresses history, that history is really nothing coherent. It's fragmented, it's discontinuous, there is no center to it. The history of this room adds up to nothing. It's a bunch of individual lives that are lived somewhat in isolation from everybody else. I mean, Goethe sort of imagined this too in a beautiful a piece of poetry. He saw all of these lights burning, these candles burning, and these were human lives that burned briefly in this more of all-engulfing darkness, I think is how he put it. And he was desperately looking for some meaning, some pattern. Couldn't see anything. Just saw these candles that burned briefly for a second. It didn't add up to a damn thing. Now, of course, Goethe was a long time before postmodernism, but postmodernism has embraced this idea of fragmentation. Don't try and create a grand unifying narrative, right? We can prove that there is no narrative. There's only discontinuous fragments. Now, here's big history coming along attempting to do just this, right? To create this grand, sweeping, single semester or single volume story that connects everything. The argument here might be that humans have always needed these epic stories. whether we get them from religion or philosophy or literature or myth or movies. Humans need these epics. They're powerful. They help people make sense of what otherwise does appear to be a postmodernist, disjointed, and apparently meaningless world. So again, quite unashamedly, big history is trying to create a narrative on this sort of scale, an epic narrative. And the fourth objection, which a lot of my students love to throw up, how can we be sure that the Big Bang is true? How can we be sure that evolutionary biologists have got it right? And I say, of course we can't be sure this is true. That someone else standing here in front of your children 50 years from now might be telling a somewhat different story for some of these paradigms, right? But we need a story that works well for this moment. And this story is based on the most up-to-date knowledge we have available, provided to us by brilliant scientists that are out there researching the minutiae of their discipline. Right? And then people like me come along, take all of their work and put it into this narrative, this modern creation story. In the same way that the Aboriginal, these are both illustrations of Aboriginal Dreamtime legends, the Aboriginal people constructed a story based on the most up-to-date knowledge that they had. So our modern creation myth, if you like, must similarly do the same thing. Moving to this idea that history really can provide us with a sense of orientation, right? Understand our place. This is just one of the many thousands of illustrations you'll see of the Big Bang and the history of the universe online if you start looking. Where are we in this story? Well, here's something that we put up quite recently. The Wmap, this wonderful probe that's up there measuring heat densities and other things in the universe. When you think about it, whether knowledge is true or not in the end might not matter. What matters is whether this knowledge is useful. Knowledge, be it the knowledge that quantum physics has supplied it with, or historians or philosophers, it's very much like a tool, right? And these paradigms of modern science are brilliant tools to help us understand the physical world. So like a tool or like a map that we use to understand different scales, different aspects of our reality, if you like. Just as an aside, there is a great need for a map of human history. I'm so envious of my colleagues in the sciences to have the Big Bang, to have plate tectonics, to have evolution by natural selection. These wonderful models which fit so much data and explain so many processes. History has nothing like that. There's not even any agreement on the terrain of what would be in such a map of human history, right? So it's really impossible, except on this macro scale, to get any sense of human history as a coherent story. Now, it really doesn't matter if you're just interested in the history of the American Revolution, right? It really doesn't matter if you're just focused on Australian political history. But on the larger scale, this lack of a paradigm, this lack of a model, is a serious problem, particularly because all of our constituents, all of our students, really want to know how they fit into space, time, and the universe. The ultimate question that I think most students, when you push them a little bit, are asking, right? What am I doing here? What's my place? What's my purpose? How did I get here? This is a very common question. As far as we can tell, every human society that's ever existed has asked something like this, a variation on this question, right? Is it possible to come up with some model that might help answer this? Some map, if you like, that might help people answer this question. So, in a sense, big history is trying to offer a series of orientational maps, right, to help us see our place in space and time. Again, the same way that the Aboriginal creation myths do, or the great creation stories of the Chinese or the African people or the North Americans. So if we can sort of not just get this right, but try and tease out some sort of a model, it can really help us start to understand perhaps where we've come from, who and what we are, what we're doing here, where we might even be going. So again, think about it as a map, right? Maps tell us a whole bunch of things. So let's think of big history as a series of maps at different scales. Again, as a cameraman with a whole bunch of lenses available. Maps of our universe, our place in the universe, maps of space, maps of time, which, by the way, is the name of the cutting-edge book in big history by David Christian, Maps of Time. You can get it at Schuler's, Barnes & Noble. You can certainly get it on Amazon. Maps of Time by David Christian. And other maps as well that I want to show you briefly now. We're looking here at a wonderful early Mercator projection map. Superb Mercator, Gratis Mercator, brilliant Flemish engraver, trying to engrave cylinders that he could roll out a one-dimensional representation of the Earth. And of course, he's sitting in his studio back in Leiden, I think, and he's getting reports from Magellan and others that are taking measurements from, rocking ships and so on. And he's trying to piece together, with extraordinary accuracy, you'd have to say, for the 15th century here, early maps. Even with Africa, I think, proportionately accurate compared to Europe and so on. Asia too small. But this is one of the very first attempts to conceptualize our globe by Geratis Mercator. So, maps of space first, right? Maps of where we are in space. Lots of different types of maps. They all tell us something. Each map tells us something different. So the street map reminds us of the neighbourhood, the particular culture of that neighbourhood that we belong to. The national map reminds us that we're all Italians in this case, right? With a shared Italian history. A nation that was only unified a mere, 150, 160 years ago. Now, I spent a lot of time in Italy for various reasons, and there's a distinct shared history, shared culture there that really allows Italians to clearly identify themselves in a way that's not necessarily as strong as some other nations. Well, what's this map tell us? That we are inhabitants of the only water-covered entity we're aware of in the universe, the only entity that we are aware of that has life on it anywhere in the universe, that we are citizens of perhaps a truly extraordinary place, products of the Goldilocks principle, perhaps. Right? Larger maps. So here's the smaller scale map. I live just down the road here, just before Lake Drive and Wealthy Street come together, just near Fuller. Beautiful part of the world, wonderful block, friendly neighbourhood. We bought the house, beautiful 115-year-old East Town house. You know what they look like. I bought it the very next day after I'd seen it, because I walked into this mansion and I said to my wife, we could never afford this. In Sydney, this will be $2 million. So we could never afford this house. And I said to the realtor, well, we're very interested, but I don't think we could afford it, She said you'd have to pay 160-something thousand for it. And I said, what? So literally snapped it up the next day, little realizing what a splendid block of artists and teachers and professors I was moving onto. And my wife and I have been very, very happy there ever since, so much so that I've had a couple of other tentative offers from other places, and I've said, there's no way. We just love living in this neighbourhood. We love living in this city, right? We love living in this, is it the 82nd, I think, largest metropolitan area in the United States? I think Greater Grand Rapids Metro, I was looking at this recently, it's in the 80s anyway. So, and if you include this huge area here, all right, there's close to 1 million people living in this entire area. Obviously the second largest city in Michigan, but only the 80th something largest in the United States. What an incredibly urbanized land this is. And what, again, a special place this is to live. This vast continent, all of this, of course, was once connected to Spain, to Greenland, all jumbled together over here. These vast lakes carved out by retreating glaciers at the end of the last ice age, 13,000 years ago. The most powerful industrial, military, economic entity that's ever existed in the entire history of humanity. Home to the third largest population on the planet, 320-something million people now, third largest population. I've just mentioned the 80 cities, and yet magnificent, rich farmland. An extraordinary part of the world, and my identity is about to change next Tuesday, if I can answer the questions. There are 100 pretty challenging questions. Maybe I should test you on some of them next week. How's your early colonial history? This map, of course, tells us that we're living on, again, this extraordinary, vibrant planet. Now, I'm old enough to remember looking at those first images from the early Apollo ships as those astronauts in the 60s took off and then turned their black and white cameras back to the porthole. And there was this fragile, tiny sort of lifeboat planet floating in this incredible sea of darkness. I think it's no surprise that the environmental awareness movement really gains greater strength from the moment we first start seeing this fragile entity, right? As I've said, this is the only place we're aware of in the entire universe on which there is life. And these continents are shifting and drifting, being driven by volcanic activity deep under the earth. You might be pleased to know that Australia and California will be next door neighbours sometime in the near future. Actually, about 14 million years from now. So, even larger scales. Okay, what's beyond the world map? What can larger maps tell us, can tell my students about where they are? So we live somewhere here, right? How do all these incredible entities of rock or frozen gases end up floating in orbit around the sun? How does all of this appear out of a huge cloud of hydrogen, helium, and other material, other elements that were left over because of a supernova somewhere in our neck of the woods. Right? What does this tell us? Third rock from the sun. What about this galaxy? You know, as we sit here, you are moving at least at 66,000 miles per hour right now as we sit here. When you think about our planet turning, you think about it revolving, you think about the galaxy moving, we are hurtling through space at this moment, all of us. And our little third rock from the sun is attached to a very obscure sun right out here, 2/3 of the way out of this vast spiral galaxy. What's in the center here? Intense black holes providing energy? We don't know. Right? But we are citizens, we are residents of the beautiful Milky Way galaxy. Now where are we? Here's the Milky Way. Here's Andromeda. We're on a collision course. While expansion and inflation is winning out on the macro scale, gravity is still powerful at the local scale. And these two galaxies, as far as we can tell, are on a collision course, but long after we're all gone. The Hubble Space Telescope has observed several colliding galaxies out there in slow motion. Where are we now? Where's our galaxy? It's gone. This is just one little cluster, the Virgo cluster of galaxies. So as you pull back and back and back, we get totally lost. My students are totally lost. And Einstein, with his theory of relativity, suggested that really there's no edge to the universe. What's it expanding into? We have no idea. There's no center. All addresses are relative. Everything's flying away, apart from a few localized events, from everything else. The best you can say, spatially, we live somewhere in the universe. How big is that universe? Now, I'm sure you folks have flown from LA to New York many times, and I'm sure you could probably guess that's about 5 hours, right, in a decent plane. Fly to the sun at United's new speed, which is cut down speed a bit to save fuel, take you about 20 years, right? Fly to the closest star in our galaxy, about 5 million years at aeroplane speed. Just trying to get some sense of the scales we are talking about here, scales of space, right? And just to make you feel even more significant, 100 billion stars in our galaxy, at least 200 billion galaxies have been counted at the moment, right? So this is some sense of where we are in this now ridiculously large map. She's lost. My poor students are totally lost by this stage. In fact, we all are. So I say, okay, let's consider time for a moment, maps of time. We can make a little time map here just for fun, right? And big history, because it does unfold this story very much chronologically, is a time map. So you know that the universe is 13.7 billion years old, as far as we can tell. Let's pretend, just for the sake of an exercise, that everything took place in just 13 years, 13 Earth years, to give us some sense of the strange proportions of what a time map might look like. So, if the universe is only 13 years old, the Earth's been around for maybe 5 years. Earth's about 4.55 billion years old. Right? Large organisms with many cells, as I'm sure you know, life on Earth well, it wasn't even cellular for a long time, then it was just single cellular for billions of years. Only about 600 million years ago do we start getting evidence of multicellular organisms during the Cambrian explosion. That was about 7 months ago. The asteroid I mentioned that struck the Yucatan perhaps 65 million years ago on our map was just a few weeks ago. Hominids, 3 days we've been around on this scale. Just giving you some sense of how incredibly recent a phenomena we are, right? Homo sapiens, of course, wise man. We've been around for about 53 minutes, about as long as I've been talking. Agricultural societies, this transition took place about 10,000 years ago, on our scale, about 5 minutes ago. And the entire recorded history of civilization, which seems like a long time, 5,000 years, was just a few minutes ago. And of course, the world our students, in fact, all of us in this room inherited, the world of the modern industrial society, literally 6 seconds ago. And so again, how recent are population explosions? How recent is technological innovation? How recent are we in this time map? And that's where we live. So, what's our place in the universe? The universe is 13.7 billion years old. Now, you don't have to answer this question, but how long have you been alive? In my case, it's 56 years today I've been alive. So, thank you. Later I'll do the mathematics. You'd be amazed. I've got to say, the standard of mathematics at Grand Valley, and I'm sure at Aquinas too, is extraordinary. You'd be amazed how many students can very quickly do this calculation. How many of their lifetimes of 20 years can fit into 13.7 billion? And I can't even get my head around the number, but, oh, Professor, that's, within like a minute, they've got an answer to that question. Can you do the math? No, I can't. But my poor friend here is feeling pretty unimportant by this stage. So my job at the end is now just to say, in fact, this utter significance is not as existentially bleak as it might appear. But clearly, this is why so many people are unimpressed with the modern scientific creation story. This is why we have such wonderful discussions in class, that only through belief in a God or gods or something greater than us can we get some sense of meaning. Otherwise, our lives really are these tiny candles that burn for an instant and then disappear and add up to nothing, right? And this is, I've just been reading this in essays. This is the reason so many students are unimpressed. As I say, half of their brain is saying, the logic for this theory is overwhelming. I can see that I have to accept it, but if I accept it, it means there's absolutely no purpose, that we're descended from slime, that the fact that the Earth is here at all in this position is just a giant accident, and there's no life after death, there's nothing, right? So it really is a moment, I was only slightly exaggerating when I said of existential angst when you're 18 or 19, when you start to think about this. Unlike most other creation stories, Aboriginal stories, religious stories, the scientific account seems to make humans utterly significant and our existence totally pointless, right? So how do you counter that quickly in a course? The argument would be that if we understand the story correctly, and based on what we know at the moment, in fact, humans are very significant indeed, even in a story on this scale. So another map, a map of complexity. Complexity is a difficult word. I'm going to offer one definition of complexity today. Scientists in the room may disagree with there's various definitions of complexity. Oh, what's missing out of here, must be the wrong font color, must have used a blue font there, is empty space, right, which of course isn't empty anyway. Space, we know, consists of a lot of hydrogen, helium, a little bit of lithium. Now we know probably there's a lot of dark energy and dark matter up there as well. So empty space, is that the most complex? A star, our beautiful sun that we may see tomorrow if the clouds part, where hydrogen is being converted to helium at incredible temperatures of 10 million degrees Celsius. You're looking at a massive ongoing nuclear fusion reactor up there every day. Is that the most complex entity we're aware of? Animals, well, we know how complex a fly is, or a horse, or human societies. Grand Rapids. Is Grand Rapids more complex than space or a star? And of course, the argument we would make is absolutely it's more complex than anything else we're aware of. Look at this, I don't even know what city it is, New York probably. This vast pulsing gathering of humans. All that energy that's being consumed and generated every second, right? Human societies. And of course, my little guide is saying, well, what's so complicated about me? I'm not so complicated. One definition only. Eric Chiasson, who's a leading big historian, written a number of books on big history. He's an astrophysicist at Tufts University, has done calculations of the amount of energy that's sort of pulsing through and being produced by different entities in the universe as measured by ergs, right, a measurement of energy, the weight of the entity he's talking about, grams, and then per second. So on this sort of scale, a galaxy is not producing that much energy because of its massive, massive size. Similarly with a star, I don't know why my number jumped over there, the surface of the Earth, the amount of energy being generated here. You can see plants in the biosphere, our body, our brain, and human societies, according to this measurement, and according to all sorts of other criteria, produce extraordinary amounts of energy. So complicated again, what a loose word. I'm just giving you a very brief definition. We explore this in more detail in the course. But one definition might be the more energy it's able to generate, right, in terms of weight, the more rare it is in the universe, the more difficult it is to create, if you like. Sort of fooling around with different laws here in a very loose way. But human societies produce, generate, and consume far more energy per size, per mass than any other entity we're aware of. We are incredibly rare as far as we know at this stage, right? And these have been very, very difficult to create, which is where the human part of this story, which is what the human part of the story tries to address. So the most complicated of all, according to this definition, think how well humans have been at adapting to changing environments. Think of how humans were able to migrate to every continent on the Earth and live there. No other large animal can do that. We are now so adept at changing the environment to suit us through our technology that some biologists even question whether large-scale natural selection will even apply to our species in the future, as we'll simply create our own artificial environments and not have to change to changing environments. And think of the amount of energy we've learned to produce from those early hunter-gatherer societies through to modern industrial society, through to a city like Grand Rapids, right? To support incredibly complex, interconnected lifestyles. So let me just conclude by saying, as far as we know at this moment, we are the most complicated thing is a word that I would shoot any student if they used it in an essay, but thing will work for this moment. The most complicated thing that we are aware of in the entire universe. Now, I've been to Roswell, I've been to the museum there, I've been to Hangar 54, I've been to various UFO sighting places. I've had a number of students who sincerely believe they've been abducted as children by aliens. And I've explored these stories and these possibilities, but I have to say, I've seen no evidence that convinces me that we have heard from other creatures with anything like our intelligence. We haven't heard from them yet anyway. So perhaps, I mean, it's a little anthropocentric, it's a little arrogant, but perhaps we can say at this moment, human societies appear to be the most complex, impressive entity in the entire universe. So here's the question, of course, and this is where a big history course comes into play, right? One of the big questions this course answers is how did human society come to be so complex? And over the next 3 weeks, I hope to give you some sense of that in this mini compressed big history course. But that's the essential question we're trying to answer. By the end of this brief sort of look at big history, this 4-week look, I hope that you, like my students at the end of a 14-week semester, get some sense of how we fit into space and time through various maps, various scales, what it means to be human, both in a biological sense, but also exploring the obvious difference between our species and any other. Clearly, we do have unique traits. How can science explain those? How can we explain the evolution of consciousness, of complex language, and so on? Right? Actually, I think science can. How we fit into this vast modern creation story, which every creation story has tried to address. How do I fit into this, right? And most importantly, as I said, this is not about the past. What can we do now to act upon, to influence this story as it continues to unfold in our own lifetimes, our children's lifetime, et cetera, our descendants' lifetimes? And Big History is about all of these questions, and I'm looking forward to exploring these with you over the next few weeks. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much. I'll be very happy to answer any questions if you have any. Oh, we've got time. Yeah, ma'am, I saw you first, sorry. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just curious, I'm not clear what you mean by the modern creation story.
Well, it's a creation story in the same vein as all of the traditional creation stories, the Aboriginal creation stories and so on, but it's using modern evidence to try and do the same thing, essentially. That's what I mean by modern. Modern in the sense of using the most up-to-date knowledge that we have. Yeah. Sir?
At the beginning you said it's a big history is the marriage of history and science. But with some of the questions that you're getting at, aren't you also bringing in philosophy/theology?
Yeah.
When you bring into your discipline, even the authors of your book, somebody with that background to help flesh out
Right.
big history.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if you can hear all the questions there. And I know we do have a microphone, I think, but clearly there are philosophical implications for this. There are theological implications for this. The ideal way to teach a big history course would be to have a team, right, that would include some people that from the philosophy or theology department, as well as perhaps a biologist and an earth scientist and so on. That's the ideal model. And in many places we're working towards that model now. Or, as you say, at the very least, bringing in a guest speaker to address some of those issues. Just in terms of practicalities and scheduling and just working out a timetable, it's evolved in such a way that often a single instructor is having to do all of this. So what a single instructor has to try and do is make space for these profound questions that, as I mentioned, are very troubling for students initially. And again, through my reading and my sort of 16 years of experience with this, I do my best to help these questions be addressed in the classroom. I'd love you to all come and visit a classroom discussion, like this Friday, for example, so that the professor is not in any way leading this discussion. I deliberately sit out in the classroom with you folk, and students sign up in teams at the start of the semester to lead the discussion on specific topics. You can imagine the earliest questions are the most challenging ones, right? the scientific account of creation versus the Christian account of creation, evolution versus creationism, and so on. The students generally handle it very well. They'll ask provocative questions. We lay down some ground rules that our job here is to come to some mutual agreement, or at least agree to disagree politely and rationally and so on over this. So there's no heated or sort of enraged discussion. There's often tears, there's often very profound discussion, and I do my job as a professional educator to try and keep that under control, and then also allow students to address these questions in essays and so on as well, that I read and grade very sympathetically, aware of the conflict that they're facing. But you're absolutely right, to have a representative of various faiths or different philosophical traditions come in would be the ideal way of doing this. Yes.
Very clearly, but I'll try. Traditional history has often focused on teaching the stories of individuals that made a difference. And hopefully in that way, by encouraging students to believe that they too can make a difference and to go out and offer their gifts to the world. And I can see where big history is going to lead to the conclusion that yes, humans as a group have been complicated and important, but doesn't it risk de-emphasizing the individual to the point where students will leave the course with a sense of powerlessness or with their with the idea that I can't do anything, why should I be involved in the political process, why should I even try, because I'm such a minute piece.
That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. Big history has to tread a very fine line there. You're quite right. Because on the one hand, at this scale, the role of individuals almost disappears from focus. And again, if you take this to sort of the ultimate conclusion, human history has unfolded in a series of huge revolutionary changes and processes way beyond the control or influence of any one individual, right? On that sort of scale. So you could argue that whether any individual in human history had lived or not, would probably still be largely more or less where we are at this moment, right? Now that's the very large scale view. On the other hand, you're right, we don't want our students to feel disempowered or that they have no agency here. So as I say, it's a real delicate balancing act, particularly towards the latter third of the course, where we're focusing very much on the 20th century and the present. And we address the sort of political issues you raise, we address cultural divide problems, we address obviously and overwhelmingly environmental issues and problems that we're facing. So then I have to sort of sing a different tune somewhat, right? That in fact, although the fact that these processes have occurred is a result of events almost beyond the control of individuals, nonetheless, you guys actually do play a critical role in what might happen from this point on. What could you do to somehow influence or somehow improve the environmental problems that we're facing? What could you actually do? And we talk again about the role of capitalism and these really large-scale processes that have brought us to this environmental moment. But then we say, but even within a huge capitalist society, your vote counts, your buying power counts. If enough people, for example, purchase sustainable products rather than unsustainable products, if enough people are swayed to vote for a particular political agenda because of the environmental stance of that person, then in fact you do matter. You can affect the future. But you're right, you've really unmasked the real ambiguity and dilemma problem of big historians there. And in all my other classes, of course, I'm teaching, we read a lot of Plato and Socrates and Martin Luther King. I mean, talk about a man making a difference. So, but it's somewhat unnerving that at this macro scale, you could come to this other conclusion. Whether there'd been a king or not, there still would have been a civil rights movement at that time, But at the end, I certainly hope my students, there's a real sense of despair, particularly when you present them with all the environmental problems that we're facing. And I use a lot of the latest data and statistics and so on. And there's initially a sense of despair. Actually, when David Christian and I taught this course together in Australia, the last class would be a debate. Good cop, bad cop. Good guy, bad guy. Optimist, pessimist. I was always the optimist, No, we're not utterly doomed. There's still a way out of it. David's got all these statistics. We're utterly doomed. There's nothing we can do. We've had it, The poor students, it was like a tennis match for the poor students, I am an optimist, and I like to think students have a lot to contribute to the future of the next 100 years. So even after making these large claim arguments early on, I bring it right back squarely onto them in the last quarter or so of the course, where human agency becomes critically important. So it's a little bit of a dancing act, I've got to say. That's a really tough and good question. Any more questions, folks? Sir?
I'm really curious about your Global Institute for Big History and the fact that you're being partially funded by Microsoft. And kind of, can you explain a little bit more about the role that it's going to have with technology education and what kind of plans you have for that?
Yeah, that's also a really good question and a vexed question for us at the moment. So you've got a group of professors that have come together to create this wonderful academic institution that will facilitate further research. I mean, just imagine the possible interdisciplinary research projects that a well-funded institute like this could fund in the future, for example, including technology for research and for education, right? Microsoft have become interested because they're working with Walter Alvarez, who's that Berkeley geologist I mentioned, on an incredible teaching tool called ChronoZoom. It's like an incredible series of maps. You can put a timeline of 13 billion years, and then you can zoom into a particular point, say 380,000 years after the Big Bang, when stable atoms were formed for the first time. As you zoom in, you've got wonderful graphics and images. You zoom in again inside an atom. You zoom in again inside a proton. You zoom in again inside a quark, and so on. So it's a sort of state-of-the-art multimedia technology that you just can't imagine. I mean, it's in prototype stage at the moment. So because Microsoft can see lots of potential for their business in this. Actually, I shouldn't say Microsoft too generally. It's the external research division of Microsoft that see a lot in this. And because they've got a hunch that big history could be taught a lot more widely in schools and universities in the future, they're happy to fund us. It's a complete no strings attached grant. There's literally no agreement between us. It was given to Grand Valley. In fact, it said for the exclusive use of Craig Benjamin, which I was very excited about when I read that. And I said to I shouldn't say this in front of our provost, but I said to my wife, you know, Rio's looking good this week. But at this stage, I mean, there's no business agreement or anything like this. They simply see that for their technology to work, they want to see big history spread, right, as an approach at the school level and the college level. So that's just one example of the sort of technology they're working on. I would imagine the minds working there will come up with all sorts of other potential technologies that I really couldn't even dream about yet, to be honest. But that's where we are at the moment. Folks, any more questions? Don't tell me I've exhausted you all.
Yeah. Dr. Craig Benjamin.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, thanks very much. It's been a very busy birthday, I'll tell you that. Very busy day.
Thank you very much on behalf of the World Affairs Council for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much.
Very happy birthday.
Thank you so much. See you all next week, I hope.